The morning the certified envelope from the Halloran Pruitt estate arrived at my mailbox on Charleston Street in Wellsboro, I had $312 in checking and a half a tank of gas in the Outback and the small steady ache at the bottom of my chest that had been there since the IGA on Main Street had closed for good on the second Friday of February. I had been a checkout clerk at that IGA for 11 years. I had taken Wren home from the hospital in the parking lot of that IGA at 4 days old. I had bought a 5-pound bag of yellow onions there on the morning of my husband's funeral, and had cried in the car on the way home about the onions. I had thought, in the way you think about a small thing when you do not yet know how to think about a large thing, that it would be there longer than I would. It was not there longer than I would. The Family Dollar, 3 doors down, had been there longer than I would. The IGA had not. My name is Esme Halloran Pruitt. I am 39 years old. I have a daughter, Wren, who is 11 and a half. I have a son, Pip, who is 6. I have lived in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, in Tioga County, on the Allegheny Plateau since I was 4 years old. And the year I am about to tell you about is the year an abandoned train car on a forgotten siding 9 miles up Pine Creek became the strangest deed in the strangest will of the strangest woman my mother had ever known. The certified envelope was from a law office I had not heard of. Yates Tannehill, attorney at law, Wellsboro. The handwriting on the envelope, in steady deep blue fountain pen ink, addressed me as Esmeralda Halloran Pruitt. The Esmeralda I had not been called since the 3rd grade. I sat down on the second from the bottom step of the porch and opened it. The letter was 3 short paragraphs on heavy cream stationery. The first paragraph informed me, with the careful neutrality lawyers use in matters of death, that my mother's father's elder sister, Mrs. Cordelia Halloran Pruitt Wendell, had died on the 11th of January at the age of 97 in her own apartment above the old First National Bank building on Main Street, 3 blocks from the IGA. I had met Aunt Cordelia twice in my life. Once when I was 7, when my mother had taken me up the back stairs to her apartment for a piece of stolen at Christmas. Once when I was 26 and pregnant with Wren and had stopped on the way back from a doctor's appointment in Williamsport because my mother had asked me to drop off a covered casserole. I remembered her as a thin, sharp-eyed woman in a navy blue dress with a single old-fashioned mother-of-pearl brooch, who had not smiled but had not been unkind, and who had told me, on both visits, in a slightly hoarse voice, to mind my own business and other people would mind theirs. The second paragraph informed me that Aunt Cordelia, by a will dated June 1979, with a codicil dated September 2003, had named me her sole heir. The estate consisted of the apartment above the bank, which had been mortgaged to the bank itself in 1992 for the medical bills of Cordelia's late husband, and on which there was, as of January, a balance of $142,000, a 2008 Buick LeSabre, which the lawyer described as of nominal value, $940 in a passbook savings account at the same bank, and one item the letter described, in the careful phrasing of a country lawyer, as abandoned rolling stock, parked at Asaph Siding, Pine Creek Spur, in the condition existing at said date, conveyed to said heir for the consideration of $5 United States and natural love and affection. The third paragraph asked me to come to the office at my earliest convenience and to bring photo identification and a $5 bill. I sat on the porch step for a long time. Wren came out and asked me what was wrong. I told her, very simply, that I had inherited a train car. She asked what kind of train car. I told her I did not know. She sat down on the step beside me and put her small hand on the back of mine where it lay on the wool of my barn jacket and said, in the level voice she has had since she was 4, "Ma, maybe it is a good train car." I drove to Yates Tannehill's office on the morning of the 15th of February with $5 in singles in my coat pocket and the certified letter in my purse. The office was on the 2nd floor of the Penn Wells building, at the head of an outside staircase painted the color of a Wellsboro gray-green that has not been mixed by any paint store since 1962. Holcomb Yates Tannehill was 73 years old, and rose to meet me at the door with the slow, careful courtesy of a man who had served Tioga County for 50 years. He was a slim, upright man in a soft, dark charcoal three-piece wool suit, a forest green knit tie, and a thin gold pocket watch chain. He had wire-rimmed bifocals, a neatly trimmed gray mustache, and the patient hazel eyes of a man who has watched grief walk through his door for half a century. He poured me coffee. He sat me down in a horsehair chair across from a worn oak partner's desk. He laid the buff manila folder labeled Halloran, Pruitt, Wendell, Cordelia, estate on the desk between us. He folded his hands. He said, in the soft, careful voice he kept for the women who came up his stairs alone in the mornings, "Mrs. Halloran Pruitt, before we get to the rolling stock, I need to tell you who your aunt was. The rest of the file will make more sense if you know. Cordelia Halloran Pruitt Wendell had been born in 1928 in the same apartment above the bank in which she died. Her father, my great-grandfather Aloysius Halloran Pruitt, had been the conductor on the Pine Creek line of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1908 to 1947, the senior conductor on the New York Division by his last decade, and the man who had been personally entrusted between 1929 and 1933 with the operation of a single private business car owned by an anthracite coal financier from Schuylkill County named Llewellyn Susquehanna Vandermark. The car was a Pullman heavyweight ordered new by Vandermark in March of 1929, delivered in October of that year, 6 weeks before the Wall Street crash. Vandermark had named the car after his own middle name, the Susquehanna. The car had been finished to Pullman's highest specification: Cuban mahogany paneling, oxblood velvet, a Persian Harry's, a built-in conductor's cabinet of solid Cuban mahogany at the rear of the observation lounge, with a single, solid bronze lock plate stamped Pullman Company 1929, and a tasseled brass key Vandermark had carried on a chain around his neck for the rest of his life. Vandermark had used the car to ride the Pine Creek line to and from his anthracite operations near Williamsport, hosting investors in the observation lounge. My great-grandfather Aloysius had been the conductor on every one of those trips. Vandermark had died in February 1933 of a heart attack on the rear observation platform of the Susquehanna while pulling out of Williamsport on the 4 o'clock to New York. He had no living children. His widow, Wilhelmina, had not wanted the car. She had transferred it by a single typewritten letter dated April 3, 1933. A letter that Holcomb Yates Tannehill now slid across the desk to me in a clear archival sleeve. To my great-grandfather, in trust for his eldest daughter, against such time as the daughter shall have need. The eldest daughter was Cordelia. She had been 5 years old when the car was conveyed to her. She had not, in the 92 years that followed, ever had what she considered need, and the car had spent every one of those years parked on a single rusted spur of the abandoned Pine Creek Railroad siding at Asaph, 12 miles up the creek from Wellsboro, where my great-grandfather had run it in the autumn of 1933 and where it had remained, undisturbed, since the Pine Creek line itself was abandoned in 1988 and the rails lifted in 1996. Cordelia, in 1979, when she was 51 and a widow for the first time, had updated her will to name her eldest niece, my mother, as the heir to the Susquehanna. My mother had died of breast cancer in 1999. Cordelia had updated the will again in 2003 to name me, her eldest grandniece. The $5 token consideration had been Cordelia's small private joke. The natural love and affection, Holcomb Yates Tannehill said with the faintest dryness, was, in his 50 years of practice with the family, not a joke at all. He pushed the buff envelope of keys across the desk. The keys inside it made a small, soft sound. 3 keys. The first was a heavy hand-cut iron padlock key, the lock on the cut-bank gate. The second was a heavy modern pin-tumbler key for the rear platform door of the rolling stock. The third was a tasseled brass key on a long, fine gold chain with the worn brass head shaped like the letter S. He said, "Mrs. Halloran Pruitt. The last instruction in your aunt's codicil is that the brass key not be used by anyone other than the heir alone on the heir's first visit to the car. I am respecting that instruction by giving you the key today and not before. You may do with it what you wish. Your aunt was a private woman. I do not know what is in the conductor's cabinet. I have not asked. I have not been told. I am, in this matter, exactly as ignorant as I was in the spring of 1979 when she first walked up these stairs with the file. He paused. He looked at me over the bifocals. He said, "There is a small leather notebook in the bottom of the conductor's cabinet, in your aunt's hand. Your aunt wished it to be the first thing you read. She was, in her own way, a careful planner. I would suggest, if you do not mind a country lawyer's suggestion, that you take the children, drive up to Asaph, walk in, and let your aunt finish what she started." He smiled, faintly, and only once. He said, in the same quiet voice, "There are some boxes that have to be opened by the right person before they will say anything to anyone." I put the keys in my coat pocket. I paid the $5. I drove home. If you have stayed with us this far, I would only ask, before I tell you what was in the cabinet, that you take a moment to subscribe to Mothers Who Inherit, because the people who stay are the people who came in carrying their own version of the IGA closing on the second Friday of February, and you should know what came of mine. I drove up to Asaph on the morning of Saturday the 17th of February in the 1998 Subaru Outback my mother had bought new in 1999 with the small inheritance she had received from Aunt Cordelia's first inheritance pass. A circle that I will only mention once, here, because the symmetry was not lost on me even at the time. Wren sat in the passenger seat with the certified letter in her lap. Pip sat in the back with his small wooden toy locomotive in his hands and a stack of 3 picture books from the Wellsboro Public Library. The road up Pine Creek in mid-February is a road of dark hemlock and bare maple, and a creek that runs the color of strong tea over flat slate ledges, and the Pine Creek Rail Trail, the old grade that the Pennsylvania Railroad had used until 1988, runs along the east bank, paved smooth now for hikers and cyclists and converted from rails in 1996. The Asaph siding is at mile 12, on a small flat clearing on the west bank, at the foot of a hemlock and rhododendron draw, where the original Pine Creek line had run a single switch off the main and a quarter-mile spur into the woods to serve a long-defunct hemlock bark tannery that had closed in 1923. The spur is, by every official record, abandoned. The trail map I had brought, printed by the Tioga State Forest, did not show it. The cutbank gate was at the south end of the clearing, a single rusted iron pipe gate locked with a heavy brass and iron padlock the color of swamp leaves. The hand-cut iron key from the buff envelope fitted. The padlock opened on the first try, with a small dry click that I felt in my chest before I heard with my ear. I swung the gate. We walked in. The spur ran a quarter-mile back into the woods through the second-growth hemlock. The rails were still there. That was the first surprise. The Pine Creek main line had been lifted in 1996, but the spur, the dead-end stub that ended at the Asaph siding, had been left behind by the salvage contractor because the lawyer of record on the title, Holcomb Yates Tannehill's father, Holcomb Yates Tannehill the Elder, had quietly filed a single sheet of paper at the Tioga County Recorder's Office in October 1996, noting that the rails on the spur were the property of the rolling stock parked at the end of the spur and were not to be lifted. The salvage contractor had not contested it. The rails on the quarter-mile of spur were rusted but unbroken, the ties were sound, and the second-growth hemlock had grown around them rather than over them. We followed the spur. Pip held my hand. Wren walked ahead, eyes on the rails. The car was at the end of the spur. I want to set this down carefully because what I saw at the end of that quarter-mile of unlifted rail in the quiet February woods is what I want you to picture, the way I will be picturing it for the rest of my life. The car was 84 feet long, and it was dark Tuscan red, and its sides were enameled steel, riveted, with 8 large double-hung sash windows along each flank framed in oxidized brass, and Susquehanna was hand-lettered in faded gold leaf along the upper panel between the third and fourth windows on the side facing me. 6-wheel Commonwealth trucks beneath, the running boards bedded in moss and the dry stalks of last summer's Queen Anne's lace. A wide, brass-railed open observation platform at the rear with a single brass marker lamp, gone soft green from oxidation and the dust of 41 Februaries. A riveted carbon steel roof streaked with the long, slow rust trails of 41 years of Allegheny Plateau weather. The journal box covers cast with the single word Pennsylvania. 3 small, green-stained icicles still clinging to the rear platform from the previous week's thaw. Wren said, very quietly, "Oh." We climbed the 4 cast-iron steps of the rear platform. I unlocked the rear platform door with the second key. The door was steel-clad mahogany, 8 inches thick at the strike plate, and the lock turned smooth on bearings that had been oiled, by my count, no later than 1979. The door swung. The inside air was the air of a closed room that has been closed for 41 years. Still, dusty, sweet with the slightly oxidized varnish of Cuban mahogany and the faint waxen ghost of saddle soap on velvet. I held my arm across the threshold to keep Pip behind me until my eyes adjusted. They adjusted. We stepped in. The observation lounge was as the setting block describes. Dark Cuban mahogany paneling above wainscot. A horseshoe banquette of oxblood plush velvet around 3 sides. The velvet faintly gray with dust, but unfaded under the dust. A Persian Harry's wool carpet the color of old amber, faded uniformly except where the small cast bronze cocktail table had bolt-mounted to the floor at the center. Brass wall sconces with their original frosted globes, the cobwebs at the joins, the bulbs still in their sockets, the original 1929 wiring tagged in the conductor's hand at every junction. The rear platform door's beveled cut glass had the etched monogram S in flowing gold leaf, and the leaf had not lost a single fragment in 41 years. At the front of the lounge, against the bulkhead that separated the observation room from the dining and sleeping cabins forward, hung a single long curtain of ox-blood velvet on a brass rod, and the curtain concealed something tall behind it. I pulled the curtain aside. The conductor's cabinet stood there as my aunt had left it. Cuban mahogany, 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep. A single solid bronze lock plate stamped Pullman Company, 1929 in raised relief. A small bronze eyelet for the tasseled brass key. The wood was uncracked. The brass had oxidized to the color of old honey but had not been cleaned. By anyone. In 41 years. I took out the brass key. I held it up. Wren said, very quietly, "I will wait outside, Mama, with Pip." She took her brother's hand. They went out onto the rear platform. I heard the platform door click shut. I was alone in the observation lounge with the cabinet. I fitted the key. The key fit. The lock turned the slow, careful way the rear platform door had turned, on bearings that had been oiled by my great-grandfather Aloysius, and then, after his death in 1958 by my great-aunt Cordelia, every 5th year, with sewing machine oil, on the same Tuesday afternoon every 5th February. The lock turned, and the cabinet door swung, and I saw what was inside. I will tell you what was inside. I will tell you in the order I saw it, and I will tell you the things I knew at once. And I will tell you the things I did not understand for hours. The cabinet was lined with cedar, the cedar still releasing its faint old grandmother's closet smell after 41 years. The interior was divided into 8 horizontal shelves and 1 tall, narrow vertical compartment along the right side. The vertical compartment held a single rolled velvet pouch tied with a brass tassel. The 8 horizontal shelves held, on every shelf, neatly stacked and bound with hand-tied strips of dark green cotton ribbon, packets of engraved certificates printed on the heavy bond paper of the period, the color of new ivory, the ink dark green and dark red, The engraved borders elaborate and floral and slightly worn at the corners of the older packets, but otherwise as crisp as the morning, they had come off the rolling press of the American Banknote Company. They were railroad bonds. I had taken a single accounting class at Mansfield University in 2004. I had not done especially well in it. I had not, since 2004, had any cause to think about the difference between a registered and a bearer bond. I knew, in the slow way you know a thing by adjacency, that the certificates on those 8 shelves were bearer bonds. Bonds of the kind that had been issued before 1982, when the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act required all newly issued U.S. bonds to be registered. I knew, looking at the engraved letters on the top packet on the top shelf, that the issuer was the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. I knew, looking at the engraved face value, that each certificate of that issue was a $1,000 bond. I knew, looking at the rate, that the coupon was 4.5%. I knew, looking at the maturity date stamped at the upper right, that the maturity was 1979. I did not yet know what the total face value of the 8 shelves was. I did not yet know what fraction of that face value was redeemable. I did not yet know what the small leather notebook in the bottom of the cabinet, which I now saw in the slim space below the 8th shelf, was going to tell me. I sat down on the ox blood velvet banquette across from the cabinet. I do not remember sitting down. I remember being seated. I remember the slow, blood-warm rush behind my temples. It was not panic and was not joy, and was something more like recognition. The way you recognize, at the bottom of a long flight of stairs you have been walking down all your life. The sound of someone waiting for you at the bottom, calling you by the name nobody else has used since the 3rd grade. I took the small leather notebook out of the cabinet. I opened it. The notebook was in my Aunt Cordelia's hand. The first page was dated April 4th, 1980. The hand was small even and slightly slanted to the right, and I knew it at once because I had a single Christmas card from her in 2010 in the box on the top shelf of my closet, and the hand on that card was the same hand. The notebook ran to 26 pages. I read it through twice, sitting on the oxblood velvet banquette with the cabinet open in front of me and the dust of February afternoon in the cut glass observation door and the small voices of my children murmuring on the rear platform outside. The notebook told me, in plain steady prose, what was on the 8 shelves and how it had got there. My great-grandfather Aloysius had inherited the rolling stock and its contents from the widow of Llewellyn Susquehanna Vandermark on April 3, 1933. The cabinet had been left untouched until October of that year, when Aloysius, on his last run up the Pine Creek line as the conductor of the Susquehanna before parking it on the Asaph Spur for the last time, had himself unlocked the cabinet with the brass key and had inventoried what was inside. The inventory was Cordelia's, copied in 1980 from her father's hand, and the inventory was as follows. Shelf 1. Pennsylvania Railroad General Mortgage 4.5% Gold Bond Series A, $1,000 face, 1929 issue, 1979 maturity, 28,400 certificates, total face value $28,400,000. Shelf 2, Pennsylvania Railroad General Mortgage 4.5% Gold Bond Series B, identical structure, 22,100 certificates. Total face value $22,100,000. Shelf 3, Lehigh Valley Railroad 4%. General Consolidated Bonds, $1,000 face, 1929 issue, 50-year, 15,700 certificates. Total face $15,700,000. Shelf 4, Reading Company General and refunding 4.5% bonds, $1,000 face, 1929 issue, 1980 maturity, 11,800 certificates. Total face $11,800,000. Shelves 5 through 7, 3 smaller issues from the Erie, the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh, and the Western Maryland, totaling roughly $13,600,000. Shelf 8, a single-bound packet of pre-1933 U.S. Treasury Liberty Loan, fourth issue bonds at $1,000 face, 2,400 certificates, total face $2,400,000. The total face value across the 8 shelves on the date of my great-grandfather's inventory in October 1933 was $94 million exactly. The notebook went on. The notebook explained, in Cordelia's careful hand, what my great-grandfather had understood about those shelves on the afternoon he closed the cabinet door for the last time and parked the car on the spur. He had understood, first, that the bonds were bearer instruments, physical objects that conveyed ownership to whoever held them. He had understood, second, that the United States government was, on the date of his inventory, 2 months into the long collapse of the gold standard following Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, and that the gold clause provisions printed on the face of every one of the Pennsylvania Railroad bonds and every one of the Reading and Erie bonds were the subject of pending litigation that would, in February 1935, be decided by the Supreme Court in Norman v. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. He had understood, third, that the issuers of those bonds, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Reading, the Lehigh Valley, the Erie, the BR&P, the Western Maryland, were institutions whose own survival, in October 1933, was not certain, and whose fate over the following half-century would determine the actual redeemable value of every certificate on those shelves. He had understood, fourth and most importantly, that the certificates on those shelves were not, in October 1933, an asset that any rational man could reduce to cash in a single transaction. They were a portfolio that would have to be unwound, certificate by someone who knew what they were doing. Over years, through indenture trustees with appropriate tax counsel, in a country whose securities law would change beyond recognition between his grandchildren's birth and his great-great-grandchildren's adulthood. He had not unwound them. He had locked the cabinet, taken the brass key home around his neck, and lived another 25 years as the senior conductor on the Pine Creek line and the most trusted man at the Wellsboro post office. He had told no one about the cabinet but his eldest daughter, Cordelia, on the day she turned 21 in 1949. Cordelia had not unwound them. Cordelia had not, in fact, ever opened the cabinet a second time after her father had shown it to her once in 1949. She had visited the car, alone, every 5th February and oiled the locks, and replaced the cedar liner once in 1971 with the help of a single trusted Pine Creek Rail employee named Conlin Pendergrass, and in 1979, when she was 51 and her own husband had died of complications from a stroke, she had named my mother her heir, and in 2003, after my mother died, she had named me. The codicil and the brass key and the $5 consideration and the careful instruction to Holcomb Yates Tannehill had all been Cordelia's own slow, patient method of saying the thing she had not been able to say in person. The thing she had not been able to say in person was the last paragraph of the notebook. I will set it down here because it is the thing I want you to hear in her voice, in the small slanted hand of a 93-year-old woman writing in an apartment above a bank on a main street in Tioga County, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 2024, 8 months before she died. She had written, Esmeralda, the cabinet is for need. Need does not mean spending. Need means knowing what is in the cabinet and acting accordingly. Most of what is on those 8 shelves will not redeem. 40% will. Some will redeem at face. Some will redeem at face plus accrued. Some at the schedule of the indenture trustee. The work of unwinding it will take a careful person 2 years. The careful person, in the unwinding, will pay enough tax to feed a small county. The remainder, after tax and after the work, will be enough to keep a single mother of 2 in our family in this town, in the kind of dignity a woman in this town who works the IGA register for 11 years and 3 months has earned without my needing to add a footnote. I am leaving you the work. I am leaving you the money. I am leaving you, more than either, the cabinet itself, the car around the cabinet, the spur under the car, the woods around the spur, and the family that built, between 1933 and your reading of this page, the kind of patience required to leave an unredeemed asset in a locked cabinet in a quiet woods for 91 years rather than spend it on a thing the spending would not have answered. Do the work. The work is the inheritance. The money is what falls out of the work. And when you are old, Esmeralda, leave the cabinet to a granddaughter who has not yet had her own version of the IGA closing on the second Friday of February. She will be along, in time. Yours, with the small reluctant hope of a woman who has not had practice in hope, Cordelia. I closed the notebook. I sat on the oxblood velvet banquette in the observation lounge of the Susquehanna, for what was, by the small brass and ivory lounge clock that had been wound by my Aunt Cordelia in October 1979 and had stopped 7 days later. Perhaps an hour. I went out to the rear platform. Wren and Pip were sitting on the cast-iron step in the soft, late February sun, with their hands wrapped around 2 paper cups of cocoa from the thermos I had brought, and Pip was running the small wooden toy locomotive along the brass observation rail in a slow, careful motion, and Wren was watching him with the patient older sister gaze. They both looked up when I came out. Wren said, very quietly, "Mama." I sat down on the step beside them. I told them, in plain words, what was in the cabinet. I told them, in the same plain words, what Aunt Cordelia had asked of me. Wren put her small hand over mine on the cast iron of the step. Pip kept running the wooden locomotive along the brass rail. Wren said, after a long moment, "We will help, Mama. We will help with the work." I said I knew they would. The next 23 months are not the kind of story I can tell you in the time we have left. I will only tell you the structure of them because the structure is what may matter to anyone who finds themselves in their own version of this story, in whatever cabinet, in whatever spur, in whatever forgotten siding. I drove back to Wellsboro that Saturday afternoon. I called Holcomb Yates Tannehill at home. He told me, in his slow, careful voice, that he had been waiting for the call. He told me I should not, under any circumstances, tell anyone outside the immediate family what was in the cabinet until I had retained an estate and securities attorney with experience in pre-1933 bearer instruments. He gave me 3 names. The first was a partner at a firm in Philadelphia whose specialty was unwinding pre-Tefra bearer bond portfolios. The second was a tax attorney in Williamsport. The third was a numismatic and financial history professor at Penn State who had served as an expert witness in 2 SEC matters involving pre-1933 railroad bonds. He told me to call all 3. He told me to keep the cabinet locked, the car locked, the gate padlock locked, and to drive up to Asaph once a week with one of the children to be sure no one had disturbed the spur. He told me, lastly, that he had been Aunt Cordelia's lawyer for 52 of his 53 years of practice and that he would represent the estate at no charge until probate cleared, because some debts in his 53 years of practice were not the kind that took the form of money. I called all 3 names that Monday morning. The Philadelphia partner, a woman named Sigourney Tatum Vermeulen, who had been doing this work since 1986, flew up to Wellsboro on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, drove up Pine Creek with me on a Thursday, and stood for 40 minutes inside the observation lounge of the Susquehanna without saying a word. When she finally spoke, what she said was, "Mrs. Halloran Pruitt, I have been at this for 39 years. I have never seen a portfolio of this period in this condition, still sitting on the shelves. It was inventoried on by the person who first inventoried it. I'm going to take this very slowly with you. We will not make a single mistake. Do I have your trust?" She had my trust. The work, as Aunt Cordelia had described, took us almost exactly 2 years. Sigourney inventoried the certificates over 4 trips up to Asaph, photographed each packet in archival lighting, cataloged the issues by QSIP equivalent and indenture, and identified, by the end of the third trip, that of the $94 million face on the 8 shelves, approximately $38 million face was redeemable at face plus accrued, primarily the Pennsylvania Railroad Series A and B bonds, which had been assumed by Penn Central in 1968, and on which the indenture trustee, Wilmington Trust, had continued to service redemptions through the Post-Conrail Trust under specific protocol. Another $16 million face was redeemable at the indenture schedule fraction following the Reading bankruptcy of 1971 and the Erie-Lackawanna reorganization of 1972, call it $8 million in actual proceeds. The Lehigh Valley and the smaller issues after research came in at roughly $5 million in proceeds against $15.5 million face. The $2.4 million in Liberty Loan fourth issue treasuries, which had matured in 1938 and had stopped accruing interest then, redeemed at face only $2.4 million flat. Total proceeds, before tax and before fees, came to $54,200,000. The federal tax at long-term capital gains plus alternative minimum, plus the Pennsylvania state tax, plus the work done by the Williamsport tax attorney, plus Sigourney's contingent fee, plus the small numismatic premium on certain low serial number certificates I sold separately to 2 collectors, left a net of $31,800,000 after 23 months of work. I took $600,000 of that and paid off the bank's $142,000 mortgage on Aunt Cordelia's apartment, paid the back taxes and the closing on it, and put the apartment into a trust for Wren and Pip with my mother's name on the deed in trust. I took $2 million and put it into a low-yield credit union account in Wellsboro, indexed to my own monthly Social Security calendar to keep me through the rest of my working life and into retirement at 67. I took $10 million and put it into a college and life trust for Wren and Pip, structured by the Williamsport attorney with milestones at 21, 25, and 30, with the spendable principal locked behind those milestones and with the income free for tuition, medical, and shelter. I took $5 million and made it a working endowment for the Wellsboro Public Library's Children's Room, anonymous, in my mother's name. I took $5 million and made an endowment for the Tioga State Forest, restricted to the Pine Creek Rail Trail and the maintenance of the Asaph Siding Spur in its current undisturbed condition. The remaining $9 million I have left on Sigourney's careful advice in a single low-fee diversified portfolio managed by a fiduciary in Williamsport, with the explicit instruction in the trust documents that, on my death, the entire balance reverts, undivided, to a new trust in the name of Wren Halloran Pruitt, for her own daughter, in her own time, for her own version of the second Friday of February. The Susquehanna I have not sold. I will not sell it. The car remains where my great-grandfather Aloysius parked it in October 1933. The spur beneath it remains as Holcomb Yates Tannehill the Elder protected it in 1996. The cabinet, with the original cedar lining and the bronze lock plate stamped Pullman Company 1929 and the 8 empty shelves, remains in the rear of the observation lounge with the velvet curtain drawn across it. I drive Wren and Pip up to Asaph on the second Saturday of every month. We unlock the cut bank gate with the heavy hand-cut iron key. We walk the quarter-mile of unlifted spur. We unlock the rear platform door with the heavy, modern pin tumbler key. We sit on the oxblood velvet banquette around the small cast bronze cocktail table, and we drink hot chocolate from a tin thermos, and Pip runs his small wooden toy locomotive along the carpet's long-worn track from the rear platform door to the bulkhead at the front of the lounge, and Wren reads aloud from whichever picture book she has brought from the Wellsboro Public Library that month. The brass key I keep on a long, fine gold chain around my own neck. The small leather notebook I keep in the bottom of the cabinet, in the same slot Aunt Cordelia put it in, with one new page added at the end, in my own hand, on the 15th of February of the year following. A page that says, in plain prose, in the same small slanted hand my mother taught me as a child, Wren. The cabinet is for need. Need does not mean spending. Need means knowing what is in the cabinet and acting accordingly. The brass key will be on the chain at my throat. You will know when. Do the work. Yours, with the patient steady hope, a single mother of 2 from Wellsboro, Pennsylvania learned, on the second Saturday of February, in a quiet woods on a forgotten spur, from her great-aunt, Cordelia, Mama. If you are anywhere near where I was on the morning of the IGA closing, with $312 in checking and a half tank of gas in the Outback and the small steady ache at the bottom of your chest, I will say only this. Aunt Cordelia is not always a great aunt. The cabinet is not always a cabinet. The $5 is not always a token. But somewhere, in the slow, patient, long-running ledger your family has been keeping without telling you, on a forgotten spur of a forgotten line in a forgotten woods, parked on a single rusted siding under a moss-bedded running board, there is a thing that has been waiting for the second Friday of February of the year you would need it. The brass key turns smooth. The lock has been oiled. The cabinet opens. And inside the cabinet almost always is exactly what you need. I drive up the spur on the second Saturday of every month. The padlock turns smooth. The platform door turns smooth. The lock on the cabinet, when I check it, turns smooth. The Susquehanna holds, the work holds, and the door opens.